boring history for sleep, the weird superstitions medieval people actually believed. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker, a world where saints' bones cure diseases, where devils make binding contracts, and where the wrong word can damn your soul for eternity. We're diving into medieval popular religion, not the sanitized version you learned in school, but the messy reality of excommunication ceremonies, relic worship, and festivals, where priests encourage entire congregations to bray like donkeys in church. Forget the pious monks quietly copying manuscripts. The truth. Medieval Christianity was a bizarre mixture of terror and comedy, where the same church that could spiritually destroy you with a curse also celebrated by parading decorated donkeys through the cathedral. So, before we get started, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey through a world where the supernatural was as real as the morning bread, and salvation was a daily transaction with very specific terms and conditions. Section 1. The universal faith and religious attitudes. In a typical medieval European village, like our representative example of Saint Aliquis, virtually every inhabitant is Christian. This was not a matter of personal choice in the modern sense. It was a simple default status, as there were no other socially or legally viable spiritual frameworks available to the vast majority of the population. From birth until death, a person's life was framed by the rituals and beliefs of the Church. Baptism, usually performed within days of birth, was not merely a symbolic welcome, but a crucial rite that cleansed the infant of original sin and formally entered them into the Christian community, or Christendom. Without it, the soul of a child who died was believed to be consigned to limbo, a state of eternal separation from God. This universal Christian identity formed a conceptual superstate that transcended the patchwork of feudal kingdoms and lordships. A traveler from France was a foreigner in England, but he was a brother in Christ. This shared identity was the glue that held European civilization together, providing a common language, Latin for the educated, a common set of values, and a common understanding of the world's structure and purpose. While a small Jewish community might exist in a nearby town such as Pont-de-Bois, they operated in a precarious legal space. They were often tolerated because they performed economic functions, like money lending at interest, that were forbidden to Christians, but they remained outsiders. Their legal status was usually that of direct property of the local king or lord, who could offer them protection for a price or expel them at will. This legal and social segregation reinforced the monolithic nature of Christian society. Other non-Christians, such as the Muslims, known to medieval Europeans as Saracens, were primarily encountered at the distant frontiers of Christendom, in Spain, Sicily, or the Holy Land, and were viewed almost exclusively as military and spiritual adversaries. Within the heartlands of Europe, to be anything other than a Christian was nearly unthinkable. This was not a casual form of religious affiliation, where attendance at major holidays might suffice. Instead, Christianity was the fundamental operating system for reality itself. It was understood that God had designed the social order. Lords were placed above peasants. The clergy held spiritual authority over all, and the Pope was the ultimate arbiter in matters of the soul, superseding even kings. This divinely ordained structure was often referred to as the three orders: those who pray, the clergy; those who fight, the nobility; and those who work, the peasantry. Each order had its own God-given duties and responsibilities, and the health of society depended on each fulfilling its role. To challenge this structure was not merely a political act, it was heresy, a theological crime, believed to lead directly to eternal punishment in a very literal hell. The common people, who spent their days engaged in agricultural labor, did not typically concern themselves with abstract theological debates. Their faith was tangible and immediate. The parish church was the center of village life, and the parish priest was the local face of this immense spiritual authority. He administered the sacraments that marked the key moments of their lives: baptism, confirmation, marriage, and the final, crucial rites of confession and extreme unction at the hour of death. The ringing of the church bell marked the hours of the day, calling people to prayer, but also signaling the start and end of the workday. The agricultural year itself was structured around the liturgical calendar, with its cycle of feasts and fasts. Plowing and planting were timed about saints' days, and the success of the harvest was celebrated with religious festivals. Their prayers were practical, focused on immediate needs: fair treatment from their Lord, a successful harvest, the fertility of their livestock, and the survival of their children through illness and winter. They accepted their position within the rigid social hierarchy as a natural, divinely ordained state, much like the rising of the sun. Questioning this order would have been akin to asking the laws of nature. The material conditions of life reinforced this worldview. A peasant family might own only 2 or 3 outfits of coarse woolen clothing, mended repeatedly over generations. Their homes were typically single-room dwellings constructed from wattle and daub, a lattice of woven sticks packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. A central hearth provided heat and light, but the lack of a proper chimney meant the interior was constantly filled with smoke. Floors were made of packed earth, strewn with rushes that were replaced infrequently, becoming repositories for waste and discarded food. In such an environment of constant hardship, the promise of a peaceful, rewarding afterlife was not just a comforting idea. For many, it was a psychological necessity. Heaven, as described in sermons, was a place of light, warmth, and abundance, the direct opposite of their daily existence. From this foundation of universal and deeply ingrained faith, we can turn our attention to the warrior class. These knights were expected to be the military embodiment of Christian ideals. Section 2. The religious life of knights and church authority. So, what did faith actually look like for a medieval knight? For a warrior lord like our example, Baron Conan, doubting God just wasn't on the menu. The very idea of skepticism didn't really exist in his world. He looked at it practically. The priests and bishops were the experts on God, just like his falconer was the expert on hawks. You trust the expert to do their job. Trying to second-guess the church on theology would seem as dumb as trying to attack a castle without listening to your siege engineer. A knight's faith was built right into his job description. The church knew that these men were professional fighters, so it didn't try to turn them into pacifists. Instead, it tried to give them a code to live by, a way to be a good warrior. This was the foundation of chivalry. A knight was supposed to use his strength to protect people who couldn't protect themselves: priests, women, and the peasants who worked his land. He was supposed to defend the church and live by virtues like honor and courage. The church even tried to put rules on warfare itself. They started movements called the Peace of God and the Truce of God. The Peace of God was a rule saying that knights couldn't attack unarmed people. The truce of God was an attempt to limit when fighting could happen. It basically said, no fighting on holy days. This meant no battles on Sundays, during Christmas, or during the 40 days of Lent. Now, did knights always follow these rules? Of course not. But the fact that the rules even existed shows how the church was trying to wrap its authority around the violent reality of the time. Even the ceremony of becoming a knight was drenched in religion. The night before a squire was knighted, he wouldn't be celebrating. He'd spend the entire night alone in a chapel, holding a vigil. His sword and armor would be laid out on the altar, as if he were offering his tools of war to God, asking for them to be blessed for a holy purpose. And when a knight like Baron Conan prayed, it wasn't always a quiet, reflective moment. It was often a ritual, and a very physical one. He might lie on the floor, stretching his arms out to make his whole body into the shape of a cross. This wasn't just a symbol. He believed it created a real connection between him and Christ. His prayer was often like a business transaction. He'd start by thanking God for past favors, winning a battle, a good harvest, his kids surviving a fever. Then he'd make his request. A knight's version of the Lord's Prayer really shows this mindset. It might end with a line like, "And I trust in the strength you gave my heart, in my good sword, and my fast horse. But I trust in you, most of all." It's a faith that says God helps those who help themselves, and helping yourself meant having the sharpest sword and the best trained horse. But what happened when God didn't seem to hold up his end of the bargain? When a battle was lost, or a favorite horse went lame? That's when things got interesting. These deeply religious men would sometimes lash out with incredible blasphemy. They weren't becoming atheists. They were more like angry employees complaining to a manager who they felt had been unfair. They still believed in the boss. They were just furious with his performance. There are famous stories of this. King William Rufus of England, after a defeat, supposedly yelled, "God will never have me as a good man. He's put me through too much." Even King Henry II, a powerful and usually pious king, found out his own son was rebelling against him. In his rage, he's said to have screamed at the heavens, "Since you, God, have taken from me the thing I loved most, I will take from you the thing you love most in me, my soul." These are the cries of men who feel betrayed by their business partner. The deal is still on, but they're demanding a renegotiation, and they're not being polite about it. It shows a relationship with the divine that was intensely personal, transactional, and surprisingly volatile. Section 3. Excommunication and Ecclesiastical Terror. Now, while a knight might yell at God in private, defying the church in public was a different matter entirely. The church had a weapon that everyone, from the poorest peasant to the most powerful king, was terrified of. It wasn't a sword or a siege engine. It was a spiritual weapon called excommunication. To be excommunicated meant to be kicked out of the church. And since the church was everything, it meant you were kicked out of society, out of God's grace, and cut off from any hope of getting into heaven. It was a kind of spiritual death sentence. Let's imagine how this would play out. Say a local baron robs a church and steals its silver chalice. This isn't just theft, it's sacrilege. He's stolen the cup that holds the literal blood of Christ during the Mass. The church's response would be swift and terrifyingly public. The ceremony would be pure psychological theater. In the main cathedral, the great bell would start to toll, but not in its usual rhythm. It would toll slowly and mournfully, the way it did for a funeral. This was a funeral for a living soul. The inside of the church, normally a familiar and comforting place, would be draped in black cloth. The bishop and all the local priests would gather at the altar, each holding a single lit candle. That flame represented the light of the man's soul. The townspeople would be packed into the church, watching in silence and dread. The bishop would call out the baron's name for all to hear. Then he would pronounce the formal curse, a horrifying formula that left nothing to the imagination. Let him be cursed in his home and in his fields, cursed in his going and in his coming, cursed in his body and in his soul. May the heavens deny him rain, and the earth deny him fruit. As these candles are extinguished, so may his light be extinguished for all eternity, unless he repents. And at that final moment, the bishop and all the priests would hurl their candles to the stone floor, stamping out the flames. The darkness and the smell of snuffed wax would hang in the air. The message was unmistakable. The baron was now an outcast, a spiritual leper. The social consequences were immediate. No one would speak to him, do business with him, or even share a meal with him. They weren't just being unfriendly. They were genuinely afraid that his spiritual contamination could rub off on them and endanger their own souls. He couldn't go to church. He couldn't have his children baptized or married. And if he died while excommunicated, he couldn't receive the last rites, the final confession and blessing that were seen as the essential passport to the afterlife. His body wouldn't be buried in the churchyard with his family and neighbors. It would be dumped in an unmarked pit in some unconsecrated field, like an animal. If the target was a king or a powerful duke, the church had an even bigger weapon, the interdict. An interdict was like excommunicating an entire region. The Pope could place a whole kingdom under this ban. All the churches would be closed. No masses could be celebrated. No marriages or Christian burials could be performed. Life's most important rituals would grind to a halt. For the common people, this was terrifying. It felt like God had abandoned their entire country because of their leader's sin, and the pressure on that ruler to give in to the church's demands would become immense. Faced with this total spiritual and social isolation, most people eventually broke. The process of being welcomed back into the church was just as public and humiliating as the ceremony that cast them out. First, the offender would have to pay. This often meant huge donations to the church that could be financially crippling. Then came the public penance. The baron would have to appear at the cathedral doors, stripped of his fine clothes, wearing only a rough pilgrim's robe and no shoes. He would have to lie prostrate on the ground, sometimes for a full day, fasting. The final act was often a ritualized beating. He would have to kneel while a line of priests struck him with rods, a physical punishment that symbolized his submission. By the end of it, the once proud Lord would be a broken man, weeping with gratitude for being allowed back into the fold. It was a brutal, but incredibly effective way for an institution with no army of its own to control the most powerful and violent men in Europe. Section 4. Festive Religion and Popular Celebrations. As grim as all that sounds, medieval religious life wasn't all fear and punishment. It's one of the great contradictions of the era. The same church that could spiritually destroy a man also sponsored most of the parties. The general attitude seemed to be that being a good Christian didn't mean you couldn't have a good time. Great pilgrimages, for example, were often one part holy journey and 2 parts traveling festival. On the road to a famous shrine, you'd see deeply pious pilgrims who had walked barefoot for hundreds of miles, but right alongside them, you'd find merchants selling snacks and souvenirs, jugglers and musicians performing for coins, and entire families treating the trip like a summer vacation. People sang religious hymns, but they also sang bawdy tavern songs. Even the church building wasn't always a quiet, sacred space. The area around the altar was holy, but the main part of the church, the nave, was often used as a kind of indoor town square. People held public meetings there, merchants made business deals, and sometimes political arguments would even break out into riots inside the church walls. The church bells didn't just call people to prayer, they also announced when the market was open, or when there was an important civic assembly. And then there were the religious festivals. There were so many saints' days and holy days on the calendar that bishops sometimes complained that nobody was getting any work done. But for ordinary people, these festivals were the main source of fun and entertainment. After going to Mass in the morning to get the religious part out of the way, people would spend the rest of the day feasting, drinking, dancing, and playing games. The dancing wasn't the polite, structured dancing you might imagine from a historical film. It was often wild, energetic folk dancing. There were wrestling matches and archery contests. By the evening, a good portion of the village would be happily drunk on ale or cheap wine. But nothing shows the bizarre, fun-loving side of medieval faith better than the Feast of Fools. This was an annual festival, usually held around New Year's, that was basically a day of authorized chaos. In many towns, the junior clergy, the young deacons and subdeacons, would elect a lord of misrule or a pope of fools. This pope would be given a silly costume and would preside over a day of complete social inversion. There were noisy parades through the streets. People would parody the most sacred parts of the Mass. The Pope would issue fake papal decrees commanding people to do ridiculous things. It was a day when the sacred was openly mocked, and the authorities allowed it. They saw it as a necessary safety valve, a way for people to blow off steam so they wouldn't challenge the Church's authority the rest of the year. Even stranger was the Festival of the Ass, which was popular in France. This festival celebrated the donkey that carried Mary and Jesus on their flight into Egypt. Each year, the villagers would pick the best-looking donkey in the area, decorate it with flowers and ribbons, and lead it in a massive, joyful parade to the church. The priest would meet the donkey at the door and lead it right up to the altar, the most sacred spot in the church. A special Mass would be held in the donkey's honor. The most famous part of this service was a chant where the priest sang about the donkey's virtues, and the entire congregation, on cue, would respond by braying. Hundreds of people, men, women, and children, would all shout, "Hee-haw, hee-haw," as loudly as they could inside the church. It seems completely absurd to us, but it served a purpose. For one day, the lowest, most humble animal was treated as the guest of honor. The common people, normally expected to be silent and respectful in church, were encouraged to be as loud and silly as possible. It was a reminder that even the lowest and most humble are important in God's eyes, all wrapped up in a bizarre and unforgettable party. Section 5. Pilgrimage Culture and Sacred Journeys. Pilgrimage was one of the most popular and important religious activities of the Middle Ages. It was a practice that blended deep piety with a sense of adventure, and it served all sorts of purposes, from punishing criminals to getting a much-needed vacation. For some, a pilgrimage wasn't a choice, it was a sentence. If a person committed a serious crime, a judge or a bishop might sentence them to a penal pilgrimage. This was a way of getting rid of a troublesome person without having to execute them. These pilgrims had to follow strict rules. They often had to walk barefoot, no matter the weather. They had to wear a simple, rough robe and were forbidden from cutting their hair or beard. Sometimes, a knight guilty of a terrible crime would be forced to wear heavy iron chains, occasionally forged from the very sword he had used to commit his crime. These individuals were living, walking examples of sin and penance, and people on the road would know just by looking at them that they were traveling to earn God's forgiveness. But most pilgrims were not convicts. They were ordinary people from every walk of life. A peasant might save for years to make a journey to a local shrine to pray for a sick child. A merchant might go on a long-distance pilgrimage to thank a saint for a successful business year. A noble lady might travel with a whole entourage of servants to visit the great churches of Rome. For many, it was the only chance they would ever have to travel and see the world beyond their own small village. The journey itself was a huge part of the experience. The roads were often just muddy tracks, and travel was slow and difficult. A journey from England to Rome could take months. There were no hotels, so pilgrims relied on a network of monasteries and charitable hospices that offered a simple bed and a meal for the night. The road was also full of dangers. Bandits were a constant threat, as they knew that pilgrims sometimes carried money or valuables. Sickness could strike at any time, and with no modern medicine, a simple fever could be fatal. But this shared danger created a strong sense of community among the travelers. People from different countries and social classes would walk together, share their food, and tell stories to pass the time. A pilgrim was like a walking newspaper. They carried news and gossip from town to town, connecting a fragmented world. An entire economy grew up around these pilgrimage routes. Towns located on the way to a major shrine, like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, became rich. They had inns, blacksmiths, and shops selling supplies. At the pilgrimage sites themselves, you could buy souvenirs to prove you had been there. The most common souvenirs were small metal badges that could be sewn onto a hat or cloak. A pilgrim to Santiago would wear a scallop shell. One from Rome might have a badge showing the faces of Saints Peter and Paul. You could also buy little lead flasks called ampullae to fill with holy water from a sacred well, or oil from a lamp that burned at a saint's tomb. The destinations themselves existed in a kind of league table. Local shrines. These were for everyday problems. You might visit the tomb of a local saint to bless your crops or cure a toothache. Regional shrines, big-name saints like St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, England, or St. Martin in Tours, France, would draw pilgrims from all over a kingdom and even from neighboring countries. The great pilgrimages. At the top of the list were the three great destinations of Christendom. Santiago de Compostela, in northwestern Spain, was believed to hold the body of the Apostle James. The journey there, the Camino de Santiago, was one of the most famous routes in the world. Rome was the heart of the church, where pilgrims could visit the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul and hundreds of other churches. But the ultimate destination, the dream of every devout Christian, was Jerusalem. To walk in the footsteps of Jesus, to see the places where he lived and died, was considered the greatest spiritual experience possible. It was also, by far, the most dangerous and expensive journey of all, requiring a long sea voyage and travel through lands controlled by Muslim rulers. For the medieval person, a pilgrimage was a physical journey that mirrored their spiritual journey through life. It was a long, difficult, and sometimes dangerous path, but they undertook it with faith, hoping to arrive at a holy destination, both on earth and eventually in heaven. Section 6. Omens, Spirits, and Supernatural Beliefs. The medieval world felt alive with unseen forces. For people of the era, the supernatural wasn't a fantasy, it was a daily reality. The world was populated by a whole host of spirits, monsters, and magical beings, and everyone knew the rules for dealing with them. This wasn't just folklore, it was a complex system for understanding the world. Let's start with the creatures you might find in a medieval bestiary, which was a type of illustrated book describing various animals, real and imaginary. The basilisk, a serpent so venomous it could kill with a single glance. It was born from a rooster's egg, hatched by a toad. The only way to kill it was to show it its own reflection in a mirror. For the church, the basilisk was a symbol of the devil, or deadly sin. The manticore. This terrifying creature had the body of a lion, the face of a man, and the tail of a scorpion. It was incredibly fast and had a voice like a trumpet. It represented the temptations of the devil, which could appear attractive, the human face, but were ultimately monstrous and deadly. The unicorn, a beautiful white horse with a single magical horn. It was so pure that it could only be captured by a virgin. If it dipped its horn into poisoned water, the water would become pure again. The unicorn was a clear symbol of Christ. These weren't just stories. People believed these creatures were real and could be encountered in the wild, forgotten corners of the world. But you didn't have to go into the deep woods to find supernatural beings. They were everywhere. Fairies, or fays, were known to meddle in human lives, sometimes helping with chores, other times stealing babies from their cradles. Goblins and imps were mischievous spirits who delighted in playing pranks. Every lake and river had its own water spirit, and every ancient forest had its own guardians. The challenge was figuring out which spirits were harmless and which were dangerous. And the most dangerous of all were demons. The devil and his legions were not abstract concepts of evil. They were intelligent, powerful beings who actively worked to trick, tempt, and destroy human souls. They could disguise themselves as beautiful women or handsome men to lure people into sin. They could possess a person's body, speaking through their mouth and forcing them to do terrible things. When this happened, a priest would have to perform an exorcism, a dangerous ritual of prayers and commands to force the demon out. An even more terrifying idea was that a person could willingly make a pact with the devil. Out of desperation, for money, power, or forbidden knowledge, a person might summon a demon and make a deal. A few decades of worldly success in exchange for their immortal soul. Stories about these pacts were common, and they served as a powerful warning against ambition and greed. Then, there was witchcraft. The line between religion, folk magic, and witchcraft was often very blurry. A peasant woman who knew how to use herbs to heal a sick cow might be seen as a valued member of the community. But if her cow got better and her neighbor's cow died, the neighbor might accuse her of using malevolent magic. People believed that witches could spoil milk, cause storms, create potions to make someone fall in love or hate, and, most feared of all, kill from a distance. One of the most common fears was the evil eye. It was the belief that some people had the power to cause harm just by looking at someone with envy or malice. A prize-winning pig might suddenly sicken and die. A healthy baby might fall ill, or a business might fail, all because someone with the evil eye had looked upon it. To protect themselves, people used all sorts of amulets and charms. They might wear a piece of red coral, make a specific hand gesture, or quietly say a prayer when they felt they were in the presence of someone with the evil eye. It was a world where you couldn't be too careful, because a supernatural threat could be hiding behind any corner, or even in a neighbor's envious glance. Section 7. Divination, Prophecy, and Holy Mysteries. In a world full of uncertainty, people desperately wanted to know the future. Was the harvest going to be good? Would a sick relative recover? Would a king win his next battle? The church taught that trying to know the future through demonic magic was a terrible sin, but it did allow for some approved methods of discovering God's will. The most respectable method was using sacred lots. This usually involved prayer, followed by opening the Bible to a random page. The first verse your eyes landed on was believed to be God's direct message to you about your problem. It was a way of asking for divine guidance, and everyone from peasants to bishops used this technique. Dreams were another major channel for supernatural communication. People believed that God, saints, and angels could all speak to them through dreams, just as they had in the Bible. But the devil could send dreams too. The big challenge was figuring out who the dream was from. Was the beautiful angel who appeared in your dream really an angel, or was it a demon in disguise? A whole science of dream interpretation, called oneiromancy, developed. A dream of a snake might mean betrayal. A dream of flying might be a good omen, unless you flew too close to the sun, which could mean pride and a coming fall. Then there were omens in the natural world. People saw signs and prophecies everywhere. Animal omens, a wolf howling near the village walls at night could be a warning of war. A flock of crows gathering on a rooftop might signal a death in that house. A black cat crossing your path was almost universally seen as bad luck. Domestic omens. Spilling salt was a bad sign, and you had to immediately throw a pinch over your left shoulder to ward off the devil who was thought to be lurking there. A ringing in your ears meant someone was talking about you. Celestial omens. These were the most dramatic. A comet, with its long fiery tail, was seen as a messenger of doom, almost always predicting the death of a king or a great plague. An eclipse, when the sun or moon suddenly went dark in the middle of the day or night, was even more terrifying. It felt like the natural order of the universe was breaking down. These beliefs often culminated in waves of apocalyptic fear. Many people believed that the Bible contained a hidden timeline for the end of the world. As the year 1000 approached, a panic swept across Europe. People saw the famines, wars, and eclipses of the time as clear signs that the Last Judgment was near. They believed the Antichrist had already been born and was about to reveal himself, and that Jesus would soon return to judge the living and the dead. Huge crowds gathered in churches to confess their sins, hoping to be ready when the final trumpet sounded. The world didn't end in the year 1000, but that didn't stop the belief. Every time a major disaster struck, a plague, a war, a series of bad harvests, new prophets would arise, claiming that this time the end was truly nigh. This fear of the apocalypse was a powerful tool for the church. It encouraged people to live a moral life and reminded them that their time on earth was short and that their eternal fate was always hanging in the balance. Section 8. Relic Worship and Sacred Authentication. Of all the practices of medieval Christianity, perhaps nothing seems stranger to us today than the intense veneration of holy relics. A relic was a physical object connected to a saint or to Christ himself, and it was believed to hold a portion of that holy person's spiritual power. Relics were divided into different classes. First-class relics. These were the most powerful and valuable. A first-class relic was a part of the saint's body, a bone, a lock of hair, a vial of blood, or even a whole head. Second-class relics. These were objects that the saint had owned or frequently used, like a piece of their clothing, their prayer book, or the staff they carried. Third-class relics. These were objects that had simply touched a first-class relic. A piece of cloth pressed against the tomb of a saint would become a third-class relic and was believed to absorb some of its holiness. Every church and monastery wanted to have relics. They were a sign of prestige and a source of incredible power. Oaths sworn on a box of relics were considered unbreakable. Armies would carry a favorite relic into battle, believing it would bring them victory. And most importantly, relics had the power to perform miracles. People would travel hundreds of miles to a shrine to be cured of a disease by touching or praying before the bones of a saint. This created a powerful cult of saints. Different saints became specialists in solving certain problems. If you had a toothache, you would pray to Saint Apollonia, because her persecutors had shattered her teeth. If you lost something, you prayed to Saint Anthony. Saint Christopher was the patron saint of travelers, protecting them on dangerous journeys. This system gave people a whole host of heavenly helpers they could turn to for very specific, practical problems. Because relics were so valuable, there was a huge market for them, which led to all sorts of problems. Theft was common. Sometimes, monks from one monastery would actually stage a raid to steal the body of a popular saint from another. They would then claim that the saint had performed miracles along the way, showing that he wanted to be moved to their more deserving church. This holy theft was called furta sacra, and it was sometimes seen as justified. Fraud was an even bigger issue. Unscrupulous traders would sell fake relics to unsuspecting believers. You might buy what you thought was a splinter of the true cross, only to find out it was just a random piece of wood. Some of the fakes were outrageous. Feathers from the angel Gabriel, a sample of the breath of the Holy Spirit in a bottle, or hay from the manger where Jesus was born. The church had to deal with the problem of authentication. What did you do when 2 or 3 different churches all claimed to have the head of the same saint? The historical Saint John the Baptist, for instance, presumably had only one head, but by the High Middle Ages, at least half a dozen churches claimed to have it. Declaring one church's relic a fake could cause a riot or a political crisis. Often, the church would look the other way, or offer a vague explanation, like saying God might have miraculously multiplied the relic. To house these precious objects, craftsmen created magnificent containers called reliquaries. These weren't simple boxes. They were spectacular works of art made of gold, silver, ivory, and covered in jewels. Often, a reliquary was shaped like the object it contained. A piece of a skull would be placed in a beautiful golden head, and an arm bone would be housed in a life-size jewel-encrusted silver arm. These stunning objects showed the immense value, both spiritual and material, that medieval people placed on these physical connections to the divine. Section 9. The world of the afterlife, heaven, hell, and purgatory. For the medieval person, everything we've talked about, the prayers, the pilgrimages, the fear of excommunication, was all pointed toward one ultimate goal, securing a good place in the afterlife. Their world was just a temporary stop, a brief and often difficult prelude to an eternal reality. And that reality came in 3 distinct, well-defined destinations: heaven, hell, and a third place that was one of the medieval period's most important concepts: purgatory. Hell, the realm of eternal punishment. Let's start at the bottom. Hell wasn't just a vague idea of a bad place. It was imagined in incredibly specific and gruesome detail. Priests described it in their sermons, artists painted it on church walls, and poets wrote about it in terrifying detail. These weren't just meant to be scary stories. They were presented as factual descriptions, a kind of spiritual travel guide to a place you desperately wanted to avoid. The entrance to hell was often depicted as a monstrous mouth, the hell mouth, a gaping maw with sharp teeth and flames pouring out, literally swallowing the souls of the damned. Once inside, hell was a place of sensory overload. It was a place of total darkness, yet somehow you could see the horrors around you. It was a place of extreme cold and extreme heat, sometimes alternating in an instant. The air was filled with the stench of sulfur and decay, and the only sounds were the screams of the tortured and the mocking laughter of demons. The punishments in hell were not random. They were tailored to the sins committed in life. This was the concept of the contrapasso, where the punishment fits the crime in a cruelly ironic way. The gluttonous, who had spent their lives overindulging in food and drink, were forced to eat disgusting things like toads, snakes, and filth, or they were starved, while being forced to look at phantom banquets they could never touch. The greedy and the miserly were often depicted being boiled in giant cauldrons, filled with molten gold and silver, the very wealth they had hoarded in life, now becoming the instrument of their eternal torment. The lustful, who were ruled by their passions, were subjected to torments by fire and ice, or were endlessly tormented by hideous demons in a grotesque parody of their earthly desires. The wrathful, who had been consumed by anger, were torn apart, limb from limb by demons, over and over again. The envious were often imagined as being submerged in freezing water, their hearts gnawed by snakes. The proud, who had considered themselves above others in life, were broken on the wheel, a horrific torture device that systematically shattered their bones. The geography of hell was also meticulously mapped out, influenced by works like Dante's Inferno, which came at the end of this period but was built on centuries of these ideas. Many people imagined hell as a giant funnel-shaped pit with different levels or circles for different types of sinners. The further down you went, the worse the sins and the more terrible the punishments. And at the very bottom, frozen in a lake of ice, was Satan himself, the ultimate source of all evil. The most terrifying thing about hell was its permanence. There was no escape. There was no hope. The torment would never, ever end. This concept of eternal, inescapable suffering was a cornerstone of medieval justice and morality. It was the ultimate deterrent, the reason why you endured a hard life, followed the church's rules, and prayed for forgiveness. Heaven, the celestial paradise. At the opposite end of the spectrum was heaven. Just as hell was a place of sensory torment, heaven was imagined as a place of perfect sensory delight and spiritual bliss. It was a place of eternal light, often described as a beautiful, walled city made of gold and precious jewels, the New Jerusalem from the book of Revelation. The air was filled with the sound of heavenly music from angelic choirs, and a sweet fragrance was everywhere. In heaven, all the suffering of earthly life was gone. There was no hunger, no thirst, no sickness, and no death. The souls of the saved, known as the saints, were reunited with their loved ones. They would spend eternity in the beatific vision, which was the direct, joyful experience of being in the presence of God Himself. This was the ultimate reward, a state of perfect happiness and understanding, that was beyond human comprehension. While hell was a place of agonizing activity, heaven was often depicted as a place of peaceful, orderly, and joyful rest. Artists showed the saved wearing white robes and golden crowns, sitting in a beautiful park-like garden with flowers that never faded and fruit that was always ripe. It was a perfect, unchanging paradise where the soul would finally be at peace. Getting into heaven, however, was not easy. The common belief was that a person had to be completely free of sin and its effects to enter the presence of God, and for most people, that was an impossible standard to meet. This is where the third destination of the afterlife becomes so important. Purgatory, the great waiting room. Purgatory was the answer to a very important question. What happens to people who are not bad enough for hell, but not yet good enough for heaven? Most people saw themselves in this category. They had tried to live a good life. They had confessed their sins, but they knew they weren't perfect saints. The idea of purgatory was the solution. Purgatory was imagined as a kind of temporary holding place, a spiritual cleansing station. The souls here were the souls of the saved. Their ultimate destination was heaven, without a doubt. But they first had to be purified, or purged, of the stain of the lesser sins they had committed on earth. The soul had a debt of punishment that still needed to be paid off, even if the sin itself had been forgiven through confession. The punishments in purgatory were often imagined to be very similar to the punishments in hell, particularly purification by fire. The key difference was that in purgatory, the suffering was temporary and had a purpose. It was a cleansing fire, not a destructive one. And most importantly, there was hope. The souls in purgatory knew that their suffering would one day end and that they would eventually be allowed into heaven. This concept of purgatory had a massive impact on the daily religious life of medieval people because it created a living connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The people on earth could actually help the souls in purgatory get through their purification process faster. How? Prayers for the dead. This was the most common way. People would pray for the souls of their deceased family members, asking God to shorten their time in purgatory. Masses for the dead. A priest could celebrate a mass with the specific intention of helping a particular soul. Wealthy people would often leave money in their wills to have hundreds or even thousands of masses said for their soul after they died. This created a whole economy of chantry priests whose main job was to perform these memorial masses. Giving alms, donating money to the poor or to the church on behalf of a deceased person was also believed to help their soul. Indulgences. This became one of the most famous and controversial practices. An indulgence was a remission of the temporal punishment due for sins. The church taught that it had a treasury of merit built up by the good deeds of Christ and the saints that it could dispense to the faithful. By performing a certain good work, like going on a pilgrimage, saying a specific prayer, or later, making a monetary donation, a person could gain an indulgence for themselves or for a soul in purgatory, effectively reducing their time there. This belief system meant that a person's death did not end their family's obligations to them. Generations of people would continue to pray for the souls of their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, believing their prayers had a real, tangible effect in the spiritual world. It created a powerful and enduring bond between the living and the dead, all centered around this crucial intermediary space between the horrors of hell and the perfect bliss of heaven. Section 10. The parish and the priest, religion on the ground. While popes, bishops, and noblemen were important for the average person living in a village like St. Aliquis, the entire immense structure of the church was represented by one man, the parish priest. He was the face of the faith, the local manager of salvation, and one of the most central figures in the community. The center of the world, the parish church. The parish was the smallest administrative unit of the church, usually consisting of a single village and its surrounding fields, and at the heart of the parish was the parish church. This building was often the only stone structure in the entire village, making it a source of civic pride and a symbol of permanence in a changing world. It was the center of everything. Its bells marked the time for work and prayer. Its graveyard held the community's ancestors. Its main room, the nave, served as a public hall for meetings, markets, and even legal proceedings. Inside, the church was a different world. In an age where most people lived in small, dark, smoky huts, the church was a place of relative color and light. The walls might be covered with painted scenes from the Bible or the lives of the saints, a kind of storybook for a population that mostly couldn't read. There would be a baptismal font near the door, symbolizing entry into the Christian life. The most sacred area, the chancel, was separated from the public nave by a screen. Here, the priest would celebrate the Mass at the high altar, the most important ritual of the faith. For the villagers, this building wasn't just a place they went on Sundays. It was a constant central presence in their lives. The man in the middle, the life of a priest. The parish priest was the man who connected the villagers to this holy space and to the wider world of Christianity. His primary duty was the cure of souls, cura animarum, meaning he was responsible for the spiritual well-being of every person in his parish. His weekly schedule was built around the Mass. On Sunday, the entire village was expected to attend. The service was in Latin, which very few people actually understood. The priest would face the altar with his back to the congregation for most of the service. For the average person, the most important moment was the elevation of the host, when the priest held up the consecrated bread, which they believed had literally become the body of Christ. Seeing the host was considered a deeply holy act in itself. The sermon, which the priest gave in the local vernacular language, was the main source of religious instruction, where he would explain a Bible story or teach about sin and virtue. Beyond the Sunday Mass, the priest was on call for all the major life events. He baptized the newborn infants. He heard confessions. People were supposed to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year, usually before Easter. The priest would then assign a penance, a set of prayers or a good deed, and grant absolution, formally forgiving the sins on God's behalf. He presided over marriages, witnessing the vows that made the union official in the eyes of God and the community. He administered the last rites to the dying. This was arguably his most important job. It involved hearing a final confession, anointing the person with holy oil, extreme unction, and giving them a final communion, viaticum, meaning food for the journey. A good death, with a priest present, was what everyone hoped for. The challenges and realities of the priesthood. While the role was important, the life of a typical parish priest was far from glamorous. Many priests were not much more educated than the peasants they served. A rural priest might only know enough Latin to stumble through the Mass and might not have owned a complete copy of the Bible himself. His training could have been minimal, perhaps just serving as an apprentice to an older priest for a few years. Financially, Priests were often not much better off. A priest's income came from two main sources: a small portion of land belonging to the church, called the glebe, which he might have to farm himself, and the tithe. The tithe was a tax of 10% on all agricultural produce, which in theory was meant to support the church and the priest. In reality, the right to collect the tithe was often owned by a distant monastery or a wealthy nobleman, who would then pay the priest a tiny fixed salary, keeping the rest for themselves. This meant many priests were constantly struggling and had to supplement their income by charging small fees for things like marriages and burials, a practice the church officially frowned upon. And then there was the issue of celibacy. The church officially required priests to be celibate, but this rule was very difficult to enforce, especially in remote rural areas. It was not uncommon for a parish priest to have a long-term housekeeper who was, for all intents and purposes, his wife, and they often had children. While this was technically against the rules, many communities simply accepted it as a fact of life, as long as the priest was otherwise doing his job. Despite these challenges, the parish priest was the linchpin of the medieval community. He was a spiritual guide, a social worker, a record keeper, and often the only link the village had to the formal worlds of learning and law. He christened the living, buried the dead, and stood as the local guardian at the gate between the earthly world and the eternal one. Section 11. Monastic Life, a World Apart. While most people lived their faith within the hustle and bustle of village life, there was another path available for the most devout: monasticism. This was the choice to completely withdraw from the everyday world, from family, work, and politics, to live in a community dedicated solely to the worship of God. The men who did this were called monks, and the women were called nuns. Their home, a monastery, or a convent, was designed to be a self-contained world, a little piece of heaven on earth. Taking the vows, the core of the monastic life. To become a monk or a nun, a person had to take a series of solemn, lifelong vows. The most common set of vows, followed by the majority of monasteries in Western Europe, were laid out in the Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century. This rule was a masterpiece of spiritual guidance and practical administration, and it was built around 3 key promises. Poverty. This meant that a monk or nun owned absolutely nothing personally. Their clothes, their bedding, the tools they used, everything belonged to the community as a whole. This was meant to free them from the worldly anxieties of property and wealth, allowing them to focus entirely on spiritual matters. When a new monk joined, he would be stripped of his old clothes, which were either given to the poor or stored away. If he ever left the monastery, he would be given those same old clothes back, symbolizing that he had arrived with nothing and was leaving with nothing. Chastity. This was a vow of celibacy, a promise to abstain from all sexual relationships and marriage. The idea was to channel all of one's love and energy toward God. This was one of the most difficult vows, but it was seen as a way to imitate the life of the angels. Obedience. This was perhaps the most important vow in practice. It was the promise to obey the head of the monastery, the abbot for men, or the abbess for women, without question. The abbot was seen as the representative of Christ within the monastery. His word was law. This complete submission of one's own will was considered the ultimate act of humility, the cure for the sin of pride. The orders, different paths to God. Not all monks followed the exact same lifestyle. Over the centuries, different monastic orders emerged, each with its own particular emphasis. The Benedictines, often called the Black Monks because of the color of their robes, this was the oldest and most influential order. Their motto was Ora et Labora, which is Latin for prayer and work. Their life was a balanced cycle of communal prayer services and practical labor, which could be anything from farming the monastery's lands to copying manuscripts. Over time, many Benedictine monasteries became incredibly wealthy and powerful, acting as major landlords and centers of learning. The Cistercians. In the 11th and 12th centuries, some monks felt that the Benedictines had become too rich and comfortable. A reform movement began, seeking a simpler, more austere way of life. These were the Cistercians, often called the White Monks. They intentionally built their monasteries in remote, wild places, swamps and dense forests, which they would then clear and cultivate with their own hands. They emphasized manual labor and rejected anything that seemed luxurious. Their churches were plain and undecorated, a stark contrast to the ornate churches of many Benedictine abbeys. The most famous Cistercian was Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful and influential religious figures of his time. The Carthusians. This was the most extreme of all the major orders. The Carthusians tried to combine the communal life of a monastery with the solitary life of a hermit. Each monk lived in his own small 2-story cell, which had a living area, a workshop, and a small walled garden. They spent almost all of their time alone, praying, studying, and meditating. They only came together in the church for a few prayer services each day, and for a communal meal on Sundays. Theirs was a life of profound silence and solitude, considered one of the most difficult, but also one of the most spiritually pure paths. The rhythm of the day, the liturgy of the hours. The monastic day was not structured by the rising and setting of the sun, but by a strict, unchanging schedule of 8 prayer services, known as the liturgy of the hours, or the divine office. The monastery bell would ring to call the monks from their work or their beds to the church. The day looked something like this. Matins, or vigils. The day began in the middle of the night, usually around 2 a.m. The monks would rise in the darkness and go to the cold church for a long service of psalms and readings. Lauds. This service took place at dawn, as the first light appeared. It was a service of praise to start the new day. Prime, held around 6 a.m. This was the first hour of the day. Terce, sext, and none. These were shorter services held at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours of the day, roughly 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m. They broke up the day's work. Vespers. This was the evening prayer, held as the sun began to set. Compline. This was the final service of the day, held just before the monks went to bed. It was a quiet, reflective service to end the day in peace. After Compline, the great silence began, and no one was allowed to speak until the next morning. This constant cycle of prayer was the central purpose of the monastery. The monks saw themselves as specialists in prayer, a spiritual army that was constantly praying on behalf of the rest of the world. A self-sufficient world. A large monastery was like a small walled city with a whole team of specialists, each with a specific job. The abbot was the CEO. The prior was his second in command. The cellarer was in charge of all the food, drink, and supplies, a hugely important job. The almoner was responsible for distributing charity to the poor who came to the monastery gates. The infirmarian ran the infirmary, or hospital, caring for the sick and elderly monks, often using advanced knowledge of herbal medicine. One of the most important places in the monastery was the scriptorium. Before the invention of the printing press, every single book had to be copied by hand. In the scriptorium, monk scribes would sit at their desks for hours on end, painstakingly copying texts onto pages made from animal skin, called parchment or vellum. They copied the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and even classical Greek and Roman texts. Without the work of these monks, most of the literature of the ancient world would have been lost forever. Over time, monasteries became major economic engines. They were among the largest landowners in Europe. They were agricultural innovators, developing new techniques for farming, sheep raising, and winemaking. Their water-powered mills ground grain for entire regions. They were centers of learning, hospitality, and charity, islands of stability and order in an often chaotic world. For a devout man or woman, entering a monastery meant leaving the world behind. But in doing so, they joined a powerful and enduring institution that was at the very heart of medieval civilization. Section 12, the moral compass, sins, virtues, and confession. For the medieval Christian, life was a spiritual battlefield. The enemy was sin, and the goal was to navigate the dangers of earthly life without falling into its traps. To help them do this, the Church developed a very clear and systematic understanding of morality. This wasn't a set of vague suggestions. It was a detailed map of the human soul, outlining the major dangers and the paths to safety. At the core of this map were the 7 deadly sins. These were not just a list of bad things to do. They were seen as the 7 root vices, the capital sins from which all other, smaller sins grew. They were the big bosses of the underworld of temptation. Understanding them was the first step to conquering them. The 7 deadly sins, a field guide to temptation. Pride, superbia. This was considered the worst of all sins, the one that led to all the others. It was the sin of Satan himself, who was an angel until he fell from heaven out of pride. Pride wasn't just being happy about an accomplishment. It was a radical self-obsession, the belief that you were better, more important, or more capable than you really were. It was putting your own will before the will of God. It could manifest as vanity, boasting, arrogance, or a refusal to listen to advice or correction. It was seen as the fundamental enemy of a healthy spiritual life, because if you were full of yourself, there was no room for God. Greed, avaritia. This was the excessive, obsessive love of material wealth and possessions. It wasn't just about wanting things. It was about hoarding them, loving them for their own sake, and being unwilling to share them with those in need. Greed could lead to theft, corruption, and exploitation. One of the most serious forms of greed was usury, the practice of lending money and charging interest. This was strictly forbidden by the Church, which taught that it was a sin to profit from the misfortune of others. Lust, luxuria. This sin referred to impure thoughts and the desire for physical pleasure outside of its God-given context. The Church taught that the only proper place for sexual relations was within marriage, and its purpose was for procreation. Therefore, any sexual thought or act outside of this specific boundary was considered sinful. This was an incredibly difficult standard to live up to, and lust was seen as a constant and powerful temptation that could lead a soul astray. Envy, invidia. Envy is more subtle than greed. Greed is wanting something someone else has. Envy is feeling sorrow and bitterness because someone else has something good. It's not just, I want your nice horse, but rather, I'm miserable because you have that nice horse, and I wish you didn't. It was seen as a truly poisonous sin because it led to hatred and a desire to see others fail. It was the opposite of Christian charity, which called for rejoicing in the good fortune of others. Gluttony, gula. This was the sin of overconsumption, usually of food and drink. But it was more complex than just eating too much. The church identified several ways to be gluttonous: eating too expensively, eating too greedily, eating too daintily or pickily, and eating at the wrong times, for example, breaking a required fast. It was seen as a sin of giving in to the body's basest appetites and showed a lack of self-control. Wrath, ira. This was the sin of uncontrolled, violent anger. It wasn't just feeling annoyed or frustrated. It was letting anger fester into a desire for vengeance and hatred. Wrath could lead to violence, murder, and feuds that could tear families and communities apart. It was seen as a rejection of the Christian call to forgive one's enemies. Sloth, acedia. This is often misunderstood today as simple laziness, but in the medieval context, sloth was much more serious. It was a kind of spiritual despair, a deep-seated weariness and boredom with one's relationship with God and one's religious duties. A monk suffering from sloth might find it impossible to pray, feeling that it was pointless and boring. It was a dangerous state of spiritual apathy that could lead a person to abandon their faith altogether. It was sometimes called the noonday demon because it was thought to attack most fiercely in the middle of a long, monotonous day. The path to healing, the virtues, and confession. For each of these deadly sins, the Church taught that there was an opposite healing virtue. Pride was cured by humility. Greed was cured by charity or generosity. Lust by chastity. Envy by kindness. Gluttony by temperance or self-restraint. Wrath by patience. And sloth by diligence in one's spiritual life. But knowing the map wasn't enough. People fell into sin all the time. The primary mechanism for dealing with this was the sacrament of penance, or confession. This was a powerful and deeply personal ritual. At least once a year, a person was required to go to a priest and confess every mortal sin they had committed since their last confession. The process had several key steps. Examination of conscience. Before going to the priest, you had to think carefully about what you had done wrong, using the 7 deadly sins as a guide. Contrition. You had to feel genuine sorrow for your sins and have a firm intention not to commit them again. Confession. You would kneel before the priest, who was often separated by a screen, and list your sins out loud. Priests often had manuals, called penitentials, with long lists of questions to help jog a person's memory and ensure a complete confession. For example, have you been envious of your neighbor's good harvest? Have you harbored angry thoughts against your Lord? Penance. The priest would assign a penance, an action to help repair the spiritual damage caused by the sin. It could be something as simple as saying a certain number of prayers, or it might be more demanding, like fasting for a day, or giving a donation to the poor. Absolution. After the penitent accepted their penance, the priest, acting in the person of Christ, would say the words of absolution, formally forgiving the sins. I absolve thee from thy sins in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. For the medieval person, hearing those words was a moment of immense psychological and spiritual relief. It was a cleansing of the soul, a wiping clean of the slate. It was a regular, structured way to deal with guilt and failure, and it offered the constant hope that no matter how many times you fell, there was always a path back to a state of grace. Section 13. Heresy and the Inquisition, Policing Belief. In the medieval world, faith wasn't a private opinion, it was a public fact, the very foundation of society. For this reason, the greatest possible danger wasn't from an outside enemy, but from a corruption within. This corruption was called heresy. What exactly was a heretic? It's important to understand that a heretic was not an atheist or someone who disbelieved in God. In fact, heretics were often deeply, passionately religious people. Their crime was not a lack of faith, but the wrong faith. A heretic was a baptized Christian who stubbornly chose to believe in a version of Christianity that was different from the official doctrine taught by the Church. To the medieval mind, this was incredibly dangerous. They saw the Church as a single, unified body, and heresy was a cancer growing within it. It was a spiritual disease, a plague of the soul that could spread from person to person, condemning not just the individual heretic, but the entire community to damnation. If a village knowingly tolerated heretics in its midst, it was believed that God might punish the whole village with plague, famine, or military defeat. Therefore, rooting out heresy wasn't just a matter of theological debate. It was seen as a vital act of public health and safety. The Cathars, the good Christians of southern France. The most famous and threatening heresy of the High Middle Ages was Catharism. The Cathars, who were especially strong in the sophisticated and culturally independent region of southern France, didn't see themselves as heretics at all. They called themselves the good Christians. Their belief system was radically different from mainstream Christianity. It was a form of dualism. They taught that there were not one, but two gods. A good God, who was purely spiritual, and had created the invisible world of souls and angels, an evil God, whom they often identified with the Satan of the Old Testament, who had created the entire physical, material world, the earth, rocks, water, and most importantly, the human body. For the Cathars, the material world was a trap, a prison for the pure souls that had been tricked and captured by the evil God. Your body was not a gift from God. It was a cage of corrupt flesh. The entire goal of life was to escape this cage and return your soul to the spiritual realm of the good God. This core belief led them to reject almost everything the Catholic Church stood for. They believed the Church, with its fancy buildings, wealthy bishops, and focus on physical objects like relics and sacraments, was a creation of the evil God, a giant deception to keep souls trapped in the material world. They rejected baptism with water, as water was a material substance. They rejected the Mass because they refused to believe that the good Christ would ever have taken on a corrupt physical body of flesh and blood. They rejected marriage and procreation because creating a new baby was, in their view, just trapping another pure soul in a prison of flesh. The Cathar community was divided into two groups. The vast majority were ordinary believers, or credentes. They lived normal lives, but followed Cathar teachings. The elite were a small group of men and women known as the perfecti, or the perfects. These were the Cathar clergy. They lived incredibly austere lives of fasting, poverty, and prayer. To become a perfect, a person had to receive the only sacrament the Cathars had, the consolamentum, a laying on of hands that was believed to break the soul's connection to the material world and guarantee salvation. For the ordinary credentes, the goal was to live a good enough life to be worthy of receiving the consolamentum on their deathbed. The Church fights back, crusade, and inquisition The Church saw Catharism as a mortal threat. It wasn't just a different opinion, it was a completely different religion that sought to dismantle the entire Christian framework. At first, the Church sent preachers, like St. Dominic, to try to debate the Cathars and win them back through argument. But Catharism was too deeply entrenched. When preaching failed, the Pope, Innocent III, turned to military force. In 1209, he launched the Albigensian Crusade, named after the southern French town of Albi, a major Cathar center. For 20 years, armies of knights from northern France waged a brutal war across the region. It was a conflict marked by horrific massacres and scorched earth tactics that ultimately crushed the political independence of southern France and broke the back of the Cathar movement. But the crusade couldn't wipe out the belief itself. Surviving Cathar perfects went into hiding, continuing their ministry in secret. To hunt down these remaining pockets of heresy, the Church created a new, formal institution, the medieval Inquisition. The Inquisition was essentially a system of mobile religious courts, run primarily by specially trained friars from the Dominican and Franciscan orders. An inquisitor's job was to travel to a town where heresy was suspected and conduct a formal legal investigation. Here's how it typically worked. Arrival and the time of grace. When the inquisitors arrived, they would announce a time of grace, usually lasting a month. During this period, anyone who was a heretic could come forward, confess voluntarily, and receive a relatively light penance, such as being required to wear 2 yellow crosses sewn onto their clothing. This was a clever tactic that encouraged people to inform on their friends and neighbors. Investigation. After the time of grace expired, the inquisitor would begin summoning suspects and witnesses. The legal process was heavily stacked against the accused. They were not told who had accused them, as the Church feared that heretics would retaliate against witnesses. They had no right to a lawyer. The inquisitor acted as investigator, prosecutor, and judge, all in one. Interrogation. The goal of the interrogation was to get a confession. If a suspect refused to confess, the inquisitors could, in some cases, resort to torture. While this sounds horrific to us, its use was, in theory, regulated. It was supposed to be a last resort, and it was not supposed to cause bloodshed or permanent injury. However, these rules were not always followed. Sentencing. Once the investigation was complete, the sentences were announced at a large public ceremony called a sermo generalis, or auto da fe. The punishments existed on a spectrum. The lightest was being assigned a pilgrimage. More serious offenders might be sentenced to prison, which was often a life sentence in harsh conditions. The most severe punishment, burning at the stake, was reserved for relapsed heretics, those who had confessed and been forgiven once, but then returned to their heretical beliefs. In a legalistic move, the Church itself did not carry out the execution. Instead, the inquisitors would relax the condemned heretic to the secular authorities, the local lord or king, with a recommendation for punishment. This allowed the Church to maintain that it did not shed blood, while ensuring the execution was carried out. For the authorities, burning was the chosen method, because it left no body behind for the heretic's followers to venerate as a relic. It was a complete and total annihilation. Section 14. Death and Dying, the Art of a Good Death. In the medieval world, death was not a taboo subject to be hidden away. It was a constant public presence, with high infant mortality, recurring plagues, and routine violence. People saw death all the time, but this familiarity did not make it any less terrifying. All of life was seen as a preparation for the moment of death. because that single moment and the way you handled it could determine your fate for all eternity. This led to the development of a concept known as the ars moriendi, a Latin phrase meaning the art of dying. This art wasn't about fighting death, but about accepting it and navigating it correctly. Popular handbooks and woodcut illustrations circulated, showing people what to expect on their deathbed. They taught that as a person lay dying, their soul would become the focus of a final, intense spiritual battle between angels and demons. The final battle, 5 temptations, 5 inspirations. The ars moriendi taught that the devil would launch a final, desperate assault, throwing 5 great temptations at the dying person. Temptation against faith. The demon would try to make the dying person doubt the core tenets of Christianity. He might whisper, "Are you sure any of this is real? What if it's all just a story?" The cure. The good angel would counter this by inspiring faith, reminding the person of Christ's suffering and the reliability of the Church's teachings. Temptation to despair. This was one of the most dangerous. The demon would list all the sins the person had ever committed, saying, "Look at your life. It's a disaster. You are unforgivable. There is no hope for you." The cure. The angel would inspire hope, reminding them of God's infinite mercy and pointing to examples of great sinners who had been forgiven, like the thief who died on the cross next to Jesus. Temptation to impatience. As the physical suffering of the illness became intense, the demon would tempt the person to anger and impatience, making them curse their pain, their family, and even God for letting them suffer. The cure. The angel would inspire patience, reminding them that Christ had suffered far more on the cross without complaint, and that enduring this final suffering patiently could help purify their soul. Temptation to vainglory, spiritual pride. If the dying person was known for being particularly pious, the demon would try a different tactic. He would whisper, "You have lived such a good life. You fasted, you prayed, you gave to the poor. You are a saint. You don't need God's mercy. You've earned your way into heaven." This was a trap to make them fall into the sin of pride at the very last moment. The cure. The angel would inspire humility, reminding them that all their good deeds were only possible because of God's grace, and that they were, in the end, an unworthy servant, completely dependent on divine mercy. Temptation to avarice, greed. The demon would try to pull the person's attention back to the material world, making them worry about their property, their money, and the family they were leaving behind. The cure. The angel would inspire detachment, reminding them that they could not take their worldly goods with them, and that they must entrust their family to God's care. A good death meant successfully resisting these 5 temptations and dying in a state of humble, patient, and hopeful faith. The rituals of passing. To help a person achieve this good death, a set of powerful rituals was performed. When it became clear that someone was dying, the family would gather around the bed. A crucifix would be placed where the dying person could see it. The parish priest would be summoned immediately. His arrival was the most important event. He would administer the last rites, which consisted of 3 crucial sacraments. Final confession. The dying person would make one last confession of their sins, ensuring their soul was as clean as possible. Viaticum. This Latin word means food for the journey. It was the final reception of the Eucharist, the consecrated bread. It was seen as essential spiritual nourishment to strengthen the soul for its passage from this world to the next. Extreme unction, anointing of the sick. The priest would anoint the person's senses, their eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and hands, with holy oil, praying that any sins committed through those senses would be forgiven. Once the person had passed away, the rituals continued. The family would wash the body and wrap it in a simple cloth shroud. A wake would begin. Family and friends would sit with the body, often for a full day and night, praying continuously. This was done partly out of respect, but also out of a fear that demons might try to snatch the soul even after death. The prayers were a kind of spiritual guard duty. The funeral itself was a public affair. The body would be carried in a procession from the home to the parish church. A special requiem mass, or mass for the dead, would be celebrated. The central theme of this mass was not celebrating the person's life, but praying for God to have mercy on their soul and deliver it from the pains of purgatory. Finally, the body would be buried in the churchyard. Being buried in this consecrated ground was incredibly important. It placed the body under the physical protection of the church, where it would await the resurrection of the dead on Judgment Day. To be buried outside the churchyard in unconsecrated ground was the fate of excommunicates, criminals, and unbaptized infants, a final, terrible sign of being an outsider. Section 15. The role of women in medieval faith. The medieval church had a deeply complicated and often contradictory view of women. On the one hand, woman was personified by Eve, the original temptress who, through her weakness and disobedience, brought sin and death into the world. In this view, women were seen as morally weaker than men, more susceptible to temptation, and a potential source of spiritual danger. But on the other hand, woman was personified by the Virgin Mary. As the mother of Jesus, Mary was seen as the ultimate symbol of purity, obedience, and maternal love. She was the second Eve, whose yes to God undid the damage of the first Eve's no. By the High Middle Ages, a massive cult of devotion to the Virgin Mary had swept across Europe. She was seen as the Queen of Heaven, the most powerful intercessor who could appeal to her Son, Jesus, on behalf of sinners. While Jesus was seen as the righteous judge, Mary was the merciful mother. People believed that she could soften his judgment and offer a gentler path to forgiveness. This dual image of Eve the temptress and Mary the Redeemer framed the spiritual lives of all medieval women. Their roles were often limited, but they found powerful and creative ways to express their faith. The convent, a room of one's own. For a woman of a noble or wealthy merchant family, one of the main alternatives to marriage was entering a convent to become a nun. The reasons for this were varied. Many women were genuinely and deeply pious and felt a calling to dedicate their lives to God. For others, the convent was an escape from a difficult or unwanted marriage. The convent was also one of the very few places in medieval society where a woman could pursue an intellectual life. While most lay women were illiterate, nuns were often taught to read and write Latin. They had access to the convent's library and spent time in study and contemplation. For a woman with scholarly or artistic talents, the convent offered a freedom that was impossible to find in the outside world. The head of a large convent, the abbess, could be a very powerful figure. She was often from a high-ranking noble family and functioned like the CEO of a major corporation. She managed large estates and revenues, oversaw the spiritual and physical well-being of all the nuns under her care, and corresponded with bishops, lords, and even kings. The most extraordinary example of such a woman was Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess from the 12th century. Hildegard was a true genius. She was a composer who wrote an entire opera of sacred music. She was a scientist who wrote books on medicine and natural history, and she was a mystic who experienced powerful, prophetic visions from God, which she wrote down in a series of famous books. She corresponded with and gave advice to the most powerful men in Europe, including the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, speaking with the authority of a prophet. She is a stunning example of what a woman could achieve within the confines of the Church. The Beguines, a third way. Not every devout woman wanted to take the lifelong, binding vows of a nun. Beginning in the 12th century, a new and popular movement emerged in the growing cities of Northern Europe. These were the Beguines. Beguines were lay women who chose to live a religious life without formally leaving the world. They did not take permanent vows. They lived together in communities called beguinages, which could be a single house, or, in large cities like Bruges or Ghent, an entire walled-off neighborhood with its own church, hospital, and workshops. They supported themselves through their own labor, often in the textile industry, by spinning or weaving. They devoted their lives to charity, prayer, and helping the poor and sick in their cities. A woman could join a beguinage for a few years, or for her entire life. If she chose to leave, she was free to do so and could get married. This offered a remarkable degree of freedom and autonomy. The Beguine movement allowed tens of thousands of women to live a dedicated spiritual life on their own terms, outside the direct control of the male-dominated church hierarchy. Mystics and visionaries, a direct line to God. One of the most fascinating aspects of female spirituality in the Middle Ages was the prominence of mysticism. A mystic is someone who seeks a direct, personal, and unmediated experience of God. Many of the most famous mystics of the period were women. While men's religious authority came from their official positions as priests and bishops, these women claimed a different kind of authority, the authority of direct, personal revelation. They experienced intense, emotional visions in which Christ or Mary would speak to them, often in very intimate and physical terms. Christ might appear to a mystic as a lover, or a husband in a mystical marriage. Figures like Julian of Norwich in England, an anchoress who lived her life sealed in a small room attached to a church, wrote profound theological works based on the visions she received during a near-fatal illness. Marjorie Kempe, another English woman, was famous for her dramatic public weeping and her extensive pilgrimages, all of which were inspired by her personal conversations with Jesus. This kind of intense, personal piety could be risky. It sometimes brought these women into conflict with church authorities, who were suspicious of anyone claiming to have a direct line to God that bypassed the official channels of the priesthood. But for many ordinary people, the emotional and accessible spirituality of these female mystics was deeply inspiring. For the vast majority of women who were not nuns, beguines, or mystics, their faith was practiced in the domestic sphere. It was the mother who taught her children their first prayers. It was the lady of the house who managed the family's charitable giving and ensured the rules of fasting were followed. While their role was rarely public, women were the foundational teachers of the faith, passing it from one generation to the next within the walls of the home. Conclusion: the texture of medieval faith. So, as we end our journey, what have we seen? We've explored a world that can seem distant and strange, a place of bizarre festivals, terrifying curses, and a deep belief in a world teeming with spirits and monsters. What's important to understand is that this wasn't a world of chaos or ignorance. The medieval worldview was a complete and complex system. It had its own logic. For the people living in it, the supernatural wasn't a superstition. It was just a natural part of how the world worked. The presence of God, saints, and demons in daily life was as real to them as the sun in the sky. We've seen that their faith was intensely practical. Relics weren't just objects to be admired. They were tools for healing the sick and winning battles. Pilgrimages weren't just acts of piety. They were the era's main form of travel, news, and tourism. Excommunication wasn't just a theological concept. It was a powerful tool of social and political control. This was a faith of deep contradictions. It was filled with a profound fear of hell and damnation, but it was also filled with joyful, raucous celebrations. It was an authoritarian system, demanding total obedience, yet it made room for ordinary people to bray like donkeys in church. It was this mixture of terror and joy, of rigid rules and chaotic festivals, that gave medieval faith its unique texture. Their world, with its enchanted forests and saint-filled cathedrals, has long since vanished. But by trying to understand their reality, we can appreciate the incredible variety of the human experience. We can see how a society, faced with hardship and uncertainty, built a powerful and all-encompassing system of belief to make sense of their lives, to give them hope, and to guide them on their path through what they saw as a brief, earthly trial before an eternal reward.